Hello and welcome along. So in this video we're going to talk about the Primarchs again. And I thought, after having done a few individual Primarch videos about their times before the Emperor, what has occurred to me in a lot of these videos is that Primarch doesn't really seem to have been created to have been the archetypal kind of general of the armies of the Great Crusade, which is kind of the generic idea of what the Primarchs are actually created to do. And this isn't the case with just one of them, and this is actually quite a lot of them, don't really fit that role. So what I thought was I'd do a video about the Primarch project and what the Emperor really intended it to be versus what it actually turned out to be. So as most people know, the Emperor created 20 Primarchs, and they were superhuman, they were incredibly gifted in pretty much every aspect, and superior to a normal human in essentially every aspect. So any Primarch, even Lorgar, can outwit a human general pretty easily. However, the idea that they were all created to be generals doesn't seem to stack up once you look at them in detail. So what we do know, of course, is the Emperor created the Primarchs before the Great Crusade started, and he created them in an attempt to complete the Great Crusade. So they are important in the Great Crusade. That is their purpose. It's important to remember that the Emperor created them as tools to complete his great work, which is the Great Crusade, to reunite humanity, but also to stave off chaos. He knows about chaos and the dangers of chaos, and he is trying to always put plans in place to keep chaos at bay and to reduce the power of chaos before it can consume humanity. And that's his great fear, is that chaos will infect and destroy humanity. This is one of the reasons, of course, why he's so keen on the imperial truth, because he knows that belief in these beings, these chaos gods, fuels them. And so he wants to take power away from them by reducing the worship of them across the galaxy. And he wants to impose order on humanity as well, because that will also reduce the power from human emotion that's going to these gods. And at the same time, it will greatly increase humanity's chances of surviving against the many xeno threats that exist in the galaxy. And so he has this plan for this new golden age for humanity, where every human will be united under his rule in the galaxy without fear of a predation from any xeno or the warp. And his Primarchs, his 20 Primarchs, are key parts of him doing this. So each one of them is a massive investment in resources, in scientific knowledge, in occult practices, in psychic sorcery, and in the application of power that he has managed to get from the Chaos Gods to help create the ultimate superhumans, beings that are as close as it's possible to be his equal. So he's not doing this by chance. He's not just going, let's just make 20 of them randomly. He's picked out this number because that's what he needs, and he's picked out their characters and their abilities because that's what he feels he'll need. So if they weren't all intended to be generals of armies, why did they end up that way in the Great Crusade? Well, it is stated in various sources that the early stages of the Great Crusade didn't go that well, and that the Emperor felt like he was behind schedule all the time, and he essentially was forced to put into the field forces that he didn't actually want to. So the Alpha Legion, for example, were added to the Great Crusade as soldiers, as Astartes, general purpose Astartes, much later in the Great Crusade than they could have been, because they were never intended to do that. That is well known. And Alpharis Omegan, they weren't revealed to the public until much, much later in the Great Crusade, perhaps because they were discovered so late, but it actually seems much more likely that they were around for quite a long time before they were revealed. And it was simply because their role was changed and they had to be used for this fighting of the main military campaigns, because there just weren't enough Astartes otherwise. And their role, and their special role as essentially spy masters, is relatively well known and understood. That's what their gifts were in. But it just so happens that there's a lot of transferable skills from being the spy master to being a general. And they obviously have these abilities as a Primarch, incredibly high levels of intelligence and leadership and so on. So they became great generals. But it's very clear that that was not intended for them, and that they had to take on that role because of the Great Crusade's military element being behind schedule. And the Emperor decided that he needed to put them in the field, to put their genetic sons to use as Astartes, rather than essentially spies, which is what they were really gifted at. So if we accept that that's Alpharis Omegan's real role, then what about some of the others? What were they supposed to do instead of being generals? Now, first, I think that a large proportion of the Primarchs probably were created to be generals, to be the greatest generals humanity had ever had, that would go and fight the Great Crusade in a conventional sense, to command the armies of the Imperium so that the Emperor wouldn't have to do it all himself. He clearly had various plans that he needed to do away from the front line, and he needed generals to take over who were in some way as competent as he was, because there was no humans that could possibly take on that mantle. And so from amongst those 20 Primarchs, I think it's fair to say that Horus, Fulgrim, Dawn, Guilliman, Sanguinius, the Lion, Perturabo, Mortarion, and Jagatai Khan were intended to be generals. They clearly have a broad range of military skills. They are natural generals, they, in the fullest sense of the word. They can command large armies of mixed troops. They have a good understanding of what it is to be a general and a natural inclination to conquest, which they all demonstrated on their own worlds, which they had managed to unite and become military leaders of within reason. And so they are the natural generals, those 9, and I think they were the ones that were intended to lead the armies. And they have slightly different skills, of course, different emphases on different aspects of warfare, but not too specialized that they can't command combined arms forces. They would complement each other quite well, but also be able to independently lead large forces. Now, that leaves the other 11. Well, first of all, obviously, there's the 2 we don't really know anything about, the redacted 2, the lost Primarchs. Now, they could have been in this group as well. They could have been natural generals. Perhaps they were. Perhaps it's more likely they were. Or perhaps they had also special skills and characteristics that we obviously don't know about that would have suited them to special roles within the Imperium, other than being a general. We just don't know. So let's leave them out of it. So that leaves 9 others that I personally believe had other roles, not to be generals. So Angron. Now, it's hard to tell much about Angron's real character because of the effect of the Butcher's Nails, but it seems like that his legion were still prone to violence and aggression before they were reunited with him, and that comes from his gene seed, not from the Butcher's Nails. They were specialists in direct assaults. They were, of course, very direct in their style of warfare, to the point where they weren't the most flexible force. They weren't particularly interested in tactics and were not great at dealing with combined arms operations, dealing with warfare on a large scale. They were just good at killing people. They were good at killing people in one-to-one situations. They were essentially the ultimate one-on-one fighters before they were kind of ruined by Angron with his overemphasis on aggression and his insistence on them using the Butcher's Nails. And he himself was an incredible one-on-one fighter, which is why he did so well in the gladiator pits of his homeworld. Not just because he was a Primarch, because he was just naturally gifted in single combat. He also kind of became worse by the use of the Butcher's Nails because it made him so uncontrollable that he made himself vulnerable. And so, although there are relatively famous occasions of him putting himself or his legion into great danger and losing battles or getting injured and so on because of how ridiculously aggressive he was, that's not really the true him. That's him with the Butcher's Nails, driving him insane and actually slowly killing him. Without them, you still are left with someone who's going to be very direct and aggressive, but probably much more skillful and controlled and balanced in single combat, but probably still someone who's super focused on single combat. I believe it's reasonable that he could well have been supposed to be the Emperor's champion, someone who would be the go-to guy if you just laid down a single combat challenge to an enemy leader and say, well, let's finish this now, 1-1, and Angron would step up and fight that battle. Because he doesn't seem to have any other characteristics that stand out from the other Primarchs other than that. So I think that really suits him quite well, actually. And you've got to remember, the Imperium is kind of the ancient world or medieval world in space. That's the character of the Imperium and the Emperor. You know, he's lived through all of history. He has this, everything about the way he does things has a kind of a strong element of the influence of the ancient world. And having a personal champion who would fight in his name so he doesn't need to actually makes a lot of sense. Rulers of the past and the kind of ruler that the Emperor was. So it would actually fit quite well into a sort of a court or a high council where he would have one of his sons be the specialist in single combat who would step up and meet any challenge. Now, then you have Corax. Now, Corax is essentially a space ninja, isn't he? He's the ultimate stealth warrior. I think his role was essentially to be the super assassin of the Imperium, to be the Emperor's personal tool in killing anyone he wants to. The Emperor was renowned for killing lots of people with assassins. Essentially, anyone he thought was a future threat or someone he couldn't defeat with normal military conventional means, he would get them killed by the Assassin Guild's assassins, or even his custodies would go and kill individuals that were threats to the Imperium. And so having a Primarch level assassin would be such an incredible weapon. That does seem to fit with Corax's character. He had this natural stealth ability to disappear and to essentially infiltrate anywhere. But he doesn't seem to have the kind of spy kind of aspect that Alfaris has, this plotting, this kind of multi-layered tactical planning that Alfaris has. And it's more about the individual ability to sneak in and just kill anybody in the dark. He does seem to be much more of an assassin than a spy. And although those kind of skill sets you might think overlap quite a bit, yeah, fair enough. But it does make sense to have a specialist in both of those skills. And so, yeah, that's why I see Corax as being the Emperor's personal assassin. Now, Magnus, of course, is stated in some of the Horus Heresy books to have been intended to sit on the Golden Throne instead of the Emperor. And that does seem to be his main purpose, to essentially be the head of psychic abilities within the Imperium. So the Astropaths and the Navigators would probably sort of report into him, and he would sit on the Golden Throne, power the Astronomicum, and basically be the Emperor's surrogate in psychic matters. And so that would take a huge weight off the Emperor having to do this kind of stuff, and so would be a very valuable task for the Emperor, and something that would suit Magnus's character, etc. And something that seems to have been almost certainly Magnus's task. So I don't want to argue that too strongly because it's already stated in a few of the books. So we'll leave Magnus there. Now, Vulkan is essentially the Emperor's artisan. He's created to create things for the Emperor that no one else could create. There are other Primarchs that have abilities similar to his, like Perturabo, and to some extent Ferrus, Manus, even maybe Fulgrim, but no one is on the level of Vulkan in that ability to create unique special items that can do things that no one else could even imagine doing, except for perhaps the Emperor himself. And so I think his job was to take that role, that task away from the Emperor, so the Emperor could, again, get on with other things. If he needed something, some special item that allowed him to fulfill one of his many projects, he could turn to Vulkan and get him to create it for him. Now, Ferrus Manus, I think, also had a special role, a separate role to being a general, because let's be honest, he wasn't a great general. And I think that was to essentially be the head of the Mechanicum. The Mechanicum were a big problem for the Emperor in the early days, in that he had to basically con them into joining him. And that was never going to last forever. The Mechanicum are fundamentally different in their way that they see the universe to the Emperor. And having one of his sons, a Primarch level being, in control of the Mechanicum would have secured the future of the Imperium to a really great extent, really bound the Mechanicum into the Imperium, into the chain of command, like all the other parts of the Imperium. Now, kind of eventually it was after the heresy in some ways, but that took a lot of trauma to get to that point, a lot of damage. Obviously the heresy itself, all the effects that had on the Mechanicum, who were pretty much gutted by that, when a very large proportion of the Mechanicum, particularly the leadership, switched to supporting Horus. And so, as the Emperor hadn't intended that to happen, his plan may have instead been to get one of his own creations maneuvered into the position of leading the Mechanicum. And there's no better candidate than Ferrus Manus. And then Konrad Curze. Well, I've speculated that Konrad Curze was essentially supposed to be the head judge, the judge in the sort of fullest sense, like Judge Dredd sense, an arbitrator, like someone who is judge, jury, and executioner. And I think that's the role he put for himself on his own planet. But I think in the Imperium, I think his job was to be that head of justice, someone who'd be head arbitrator. I think they're Grand Marshal or something. But their job would be to be in charge of the Imperium's police force and justice system, and to head that up, to organise it, and to act as a sort of ultimate judge. And I think he'd be great at that had he not gone insane. So if he hadn't had his problem with visions that drove him insane, I think he'd have been an excellent candidate for that role. And would have held the Imperium together, would have helped to repress any uprisings and any issues with chaos, corruption, and so on. And so an Imperium that the Emperor may have imagined with these 20 Primarchs who were uncorrupted by chaos, that could have been a great role for Konrad Curze. And I think that has to be a reasonably strong case for this, because that fits so well with his character that the Emperor had given him, had decided to create him with. And it would have been an essential role in any imperial government, and something that you can't really rely on a human to do very well. And that because of the constant risk of corruption, not just chaos corruption, but the constant risk of just normal human corruption, of being in power and using that for their own means. Now, of course, the Primarchs turned out to be corrupt as well, but that's not what the Emperor created them to be. He created them to be perfect beings, and so his idea for what Konrad Curze could have been may well have been that ultimate head of justice within the Imperium. And finally, Lorgar. Well, I did a previous video about Lorgar not too long ago. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. And in which I speculated essentially that his job was to be the herald of the Emperor, to be the person that was the chief propagandist of the Emperor, to go out and persuade people that the imperial truth was the right way. And that suits his personality, his incredible charisma, his ability to convince people to do things, to believe things. And essentially, he would be head iterator. And the iterators were an organization within the Imperium who, as part of the Great Crusade, would go to worlds that had been conquered and persuade the population that they should adopt the imperial truth, and to persuade them that they were much better off within the Imperium, and to build cohesion that way. Because you've got all these different human populations that have lived differently, lived separately, have very distinct cultures, and many of them were very reluctant to join the Imperium. And they needed to be culturally changed to be effective members of the Imperium and to not revolt in the future. And there's no one better than that, than an uncorrupted Lorgar. So I think that was his job, to be essentially head iterator. And finally, the great Leman himself, Leman Russ. What was his real job? He certainly wasn't supposed to be a general. The guy's completely incompetent. In fact, I think in my Lorgar video I said that all the other Primarchs were great generals other than Lorgar. But that's not really true, is it? I mean, we've touched on Ferrus Manus and his shaky abilities as a general, but Leman Russ is a terrible general. But he is a great one-on-one fighter, but not as great as Angron, although he'd like to think he was, but he isn't. He might have beaten Angron in a one-on-one fight because Angron was affected by the Butcher's Nails and was too aggressive, but actually the evidence suggests that that isn't the case, and that when they did fight once, Angron beat him anyway. You can argue amongst yourselves on which one would have won in a one-on-one fight, but I'm pretty sure Angron would have. And without the Butcher's Nails, he definitely would have. So what was Russ's actual job if it wasn't to be the Emperor's champion, which I think that definitely a job that Angron, without the Butcher's Nails, would be much better suited to. But we do know that Russ had some specific role where his intense loyalty to the Emperor was important. And he kind of likes to think of himself as the Emperor's executioner, someone who goes around and kills any of the Emperor's enemies. If you act up against the Emperor, then he's going to be the one that suddenly appears with his legion to kill you. Now, I think there is some truth in this, the idea of the Emperor's executioner, but not entirely. I don't think the Emperor created a Primarch to kill other Primarchs. I don't think he believed he was creating beings that could be corrupted. So in his mind, he wouldn't create a failsafe who was another Primarch who could kill the other Primarch should they go rogue. If he wasn't designed to lead a legion, he wasn't designed to go and execute rogue Primarchs. What was he intended for? Something relatively similar to that, I think, where he would have been the Emperor's personal weapon to go and kill people that he didn't like or were problems for him, but who weren't Primarchs. There were obviously many of these people across Terra, but also across the galaxy. And within the lore, there is this idea of Russ and Constantine Valdor, the head of the Custodes, being linked in that they are supposed to be equals and opposites. So they're equal in ability and their loyalty to the Emperor, but they're opposites in character. And so their roles are different, but they are linked. So the Emperor created both of them to do specific tasks to do with protecting him, where absolute loyalty would be extremely important. So Valdor, of course, leads the Custodes. That's his job. He's the head bodyguard. He's responsible for the Emperor's personal security. Very important role. But he's very focused on the Emperor's household, the close protection of the Emperor within the Imperial Palace, and when the Emperor goes out, being his personal bodyguard. And I think Russ's job is more like to protect the Emperor at a distance, to go out into the galaxy and to seek out and to hunt down the Emperor's enemies, And that's one of his great skills. He is a hunter. Yes, he is a natural fighter, but he's more of a hunter than a soldier or a champion. And so he would go out and seek out the Emperor's enemies across the galaxy and destroy them in a way that was very public and obvious, not like a space ninja, which I would see Corax doing, killing someone in the dark, in silence, no one knowing that he'd even been there. That's the way that you might want to kill some of your enemies, but others need to be killed publicly and very brutally, and that's when you send Russ. So that's what I think his role was, essentially the Emperor's hunter. And I think that suits his character. It makes much more sense of his character, why he isn't a great general, but why he clearly isn't that good at killing other Primarchs either, even though he claims to have been created to do that. So there you go. That's my thoughts on the other potential roles of the Primarchs in a more idealized universe where the chaos corruption didn't occur, and what the Emperor may have originally envisioned these Primarchs being. So let me know what you think in the comments. Maybe you have different ideas about what their roles could have been. Maybe you think I'm completely off the mark and actually they're all intended to be generals. Also, it might be interesting in the future to do a video on the 2 lost Primarchs and like what their roles might have been intended to be if they weren't just another 2 generals. What would they? Maybe they could have had specific roles within the Imperium. And is there obvious missing roles from within a kind of a leadership of the Imperium that they could have been suited for? Once you consider the known Primarch in the roles that they seem to be suited for. Anyway, so thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.